Revealed, a police officer grants the last wish of the billionaire's adopted daughter, and the request stunned everyone. Daniel Hayes was not the kind of man who expected headlines. He kept to routines: an early run through the park before the city woke, eggs with his wife before he donned his uniform, kisses for the kids that were sometimes hurried, but always real. He had learned over more than a decade on the force the particular grammar of small kindnesses. A cup of coffee left for a colleague who pulled night shifts, a gentle word for a shaken witness, a full report filed on time. Discipline had become his religion, predictability, his comfort. That morning the familiar had a fissure. A lieutenant called him in. A simple request, they said. A welfare check at a municipal hospital where a woman in custody was being held under observation. No drama expected. Paperwork, a brief interview, a signature. Routine. Daniel finished his coffee, kissed his wife, and reminded himself to pick the younger boy up from soccer that afternoon. He left his home the way he always did, believing for a moment he understood the limits of his world. The holding room at East Side General was lit by the kind of fluorescent honesty hospitals favor. The woman on the cot did not look like the image the press would later insist on making of her. Not a caricature drowned in jewels or a walled-off figure shielded by lawyers. She looked small against the white sheet, palms folded over an old photograph that had been tucked into the heel of a worn paperback. Her hair was pulled back with care. Her eyes were alert, not glazed. There was a steadiness in the way she breathed, as if she had rehearsed this moment until the words fit. "Officer Hayes," she said, when he introduced himself. Her voice surprised him. It was matter-of-fact, a quietness that suggested she measured each syllable for someone else's sake. "If you can do one thing for me, I need to see my son." The words landed like a hand on his chest. He had interviewed battered spouses and anxious fathers, held the hands of people in custody who wanted more than anything a sight of a child. But there was something in the way she said, "my son," that made the world compress to the size of that phrase. Daniel had been an officer long enough to know how small the system made a human being. Case numbers replaced compassion. Headlines replaced context. This was a woman who had been placed into boxes by unfamiliar forces, a court form, an article, a social media thread. "Tell me his name," Daniel asked. "Noah," she said. "He's with my sister right now. I haven't seen him in weeks. I don't know how long I have." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. The shape of a last wish needs no proof. It is proof itself. "And you want a visit?" "Not just a visit." She watched him, and in the watchfulness he understood. A protected, supervised moment. 10 minutes. "I don't want headlines. I don't want a story. I want him to know I loved him." There was the other shape to the story, the part that would make the tabloids salivate. The woman was, by adoption, the daughter of someone with wealth that could buy silence and lawyers in any county. The word billionaire hung over her like an accusation and a promise. Newsfeeds would call it a scandal, a scion in custody, privilege meeting punishment. But her folded hands kept the story tautly human. The photograph she pressed to her chest showed a toddler, hair sticking up like he had been ruffled by a guilty grandfather. Her thumb traced the child's face as if the motion could carve the moment into bone. Daniel listened. He asked a few quick practical questions. When had she last seen Noah, who formerly held custody? What were the medical notes on her file? He took care to write it all down because that was how he operated. Facts first, then feelings slotted in afterward. Still, he felt the kind of tug that did not fit neatly on paper. There was an immediate calculus in his head. This request could be allowed under certain compassionate visit protocols. It could be denied under the same paperwork, depending on how a dozen people chose to read a rule. Why me? He wondered inwardly, because the woman looked at him as if his presence mattered more than the badge on his chest. She had nothing to gain from flattering him. She had everything to lose by asking anyone at all. "Because you're here," she said simply. Because you seem, her voice almost broke but steadied, like you've seen what's behind the file. Daniel left the hospital with the photograph crumpled into the pocket of his uniform like a small, awkward talisman. On his way back to the precinct, the city itself felt louder. Horns, dog walkers, a vendor tinkling change like bells. He sat in his patrol car and took out his phone. He called the number on the custody paperwork, scribbled as he spoke, and tried to arrange the impossible within the possible. There is a language to restraint. "We can request a supervised visit," he told the person on the other end. "But I need to file a motion. There are forms." He recited procedure like a solemn litany, and each time the litany paused, he pressed against the edges of it. When he walked into the roll call room, his lieutenant's eyebrows rose in a silent question. Daniel told the story plainly. The woman in hospital custody, the photograph of a small boy, her request for a last visit. He expected a familiar response, caution, forms, perhaps a canned "we'll see." Instead, there was a thin smile and an offhand warning about optics. "You know how this reads, Hayes," his lieutenant said, folding his arms. "You try to sway the judge with a sob story. The paper eats it alive. We have to be careful." Daniel heard the caution as a kind of accusation. He worked in a place that afforded him authority, but also taught deference to protocol. He knew the chain of command, like the folds of his uniform. But when he thought of the photograph and the quiet way the woman had confessed the shape of her longing, the chain of command felt suddenly heavy, like something that could be bent without being broken. After the brief rolling of eyes and warnings, Daniel did what he always did. He prepared. He filed the required forms to request a supervised visit. He made an appointment with the social worker on duty at the detention center. He tracked down the name of the child's guardian, who, according to a terse note, was an aunt with a steady job and a house on the city's edge. He called the victim-witness liaison to check for any red flags. Each step carried with it the elevated risk of pushing the case into public view. A single misstep, and what had once been a private plea could become a headline that swallowed compassion whole. There are things in life that change how a person sees the world. The birth of a child, the death of a friend, a memory of their own mother at a bedside. For Daniel, a particular image punctured his reserve early. The night he found a crying woman on the subway platform holding a limp infant, while the rest of the world pretended not to notice. He had taken the child out of that moment and put both of them into the safety of the precinct for the night. The system processed them, and later the child went into the proper channels. He had watched the infant be readied for a different life, and had quietly, privately, promised himself that he would never let a system's indifference erase the humanity of a body in need. That promise sat now like an old coin in his pocket, warm from years of being carried. "Stick to procedure, Hayes," his lieutenant had said. The words landed, but they did not remove the photograph from his mind. A CTA of sorts felt appropriate then, an ordinary human request in a world of ordinary content. If this story is speaking to you, if the image of the photograph or the idea of a last visit makes something stir, subscribe to follow what happens next. Stories like this don't solve themselves. They depend on attention, on people who keep watching. He bent himself to the work, with a focus that left his family at home a dim echo. His wife, a school nurse named Rachel, saw him at dinner with the ghost of an exhausted smile, and asked, as she always did gently, "How was your day?" He told her there had been another welfare check. He did not tell her the woman was an adopted daughter of a billionaire. He did not say, "She asked to see her son, and I promised to try." Promises, he knew, had a way of becoming exposures when made in kitchens. Rachel folded his confession into a patient silence. She had learned to listen to the way he loved without needing to be involved in every battle. What Daniel did tell his wife was the part that made her reach across the table and squeeze his hand. "Every person is more than their most public moment," he said, and she nodded as if this was something they both believed in quietly. She said nothing about the risk. She trusted his judgment, but she also knew the fragility of a career built on a reputation of integrity. Daniel felt that fragility now as a weight in his chest, an awareness that an act of compassion would be measured in more than goodwill. There would be consequences, and they might be costly. For the next several days, Daniel moved through a geography of bureaucracy. He met the social worker, a lean woman with alert eyes named Carla, who told him in private that compassion was a daily negotiation in her work. He sat with the public defender assigned to the detained woman, an efficient man who was weary in the way of someone who had seen too many cases of promise and little follow-through. He listened to the clerk in juvenile services say, "If there was ever a case for a supervised visit, this is it," and then add, almost immediately, "but the courts move slowly." He called the guardian, the aunt, who was at once protective and practical. "She messed up, sure," the aunt said over a phone line thick with the city, "but Noah is a child. He deserves to see his mother if it can be done safely." Her voice surprised him. She did not sound like a person who wanted tabloids. She sounded like a woman who guarded a child's peace. At times, the process moved with a deliberate slowness that felt like designed cruelty. At other moments, openings appeared so quickly they startled him. He drafted a request for a compassionate visit with careful language, supervised, brief, no media, no glamour. He attached a statement from the social worker vouching for the woman's stability. He gathered a letter, quiet, earnest, from a neighbor in the wealthy enclave who had once opened a door to the woman on a cold night and witnessed tenderness, not entitlement. Each statement was an attempt to reframe a public perception into a human one. A string of small victories arrived. The defense attorney scheduled a pre-hearing. The guardian tentatively agreed to cooperate. Juvenile services offered a supervised setting at the facility that would allow the child to be present without exposing him to courtroom spectacle. Daniel felt the momentum shift, and with it the temperature in the precinct. Caution gave way to a whisper of possibility. Still, there were those who read the situation through an angle Daniel could not avoid. A colleague named Marcus, efficient, observant, not unkind, raised an eyebrow when Daniel walked him through the itinerary. "You sure you want to be the face of this?" Marcus asked. "You push, and someone will say you let your heart run policy. You could lose a promotion. You could get pulled into an internal." Daniel had rehearsed the answer to that question in the long, solitary hours between forms and phone calls. He thought of Noah's photograph and the woman tracing the child's cheek with a finger, like carving memory into skin. He thought of a city in which the wealthy could sometimes fund an erasure of harm with quick settlements and softer publicity, and of a world in which a child's right to know a parent could be lost in a maze of optics. He thought of his wife and their own children. He thought, too, of the long line of officers who had chosen to obey rules when the right thing required bending them toward mercy. "I don't care about promotions," he told Marcus. "I care about what we do with the authority we have." Alongside the human currents ran another colder current, public curiosity. The woman's tenuous connection to wealth made the story click into a different register the moment someone in the neighborhood sheeted a rumor. Social media moved with its blunt curiosity, and within a day there were blogs and chatter about the billionaire's adopted daughter in custody and 1,000 takes on what the visit might mean. Daniel saw the headlines like a pressure that could blow the entire plan to pieces. He tried to keep the machinery of his request shielded, insisting on confidentiality, but a leak is sometimes simply a series of well-meaning hands, and information once out is eager to be more than it was intended. The juxtaposition of the woman's private grief and the public appetite for spectacle made Daniel more acutely aware of the class wedge that the title of her backstory created. He had worked cases involving privilege before. The wealthy could pay for legal expertise, public relations spin, and structural buffers that insulated them from public scrutiny. To the rest of the city, privilege could look like a climate of its own. Yet what was being asked of him had nothing to do with social standing. It had to do with a child's right to the presence of a mother, however complicated that mother's life might be. Daniel began to realize his advocacy would require more than paperwork and a sympathetic social worker. It would require him to make the case, not in legalese, but in human terms. He drafted a letter to the magistrate assigned to review compassionate visit requests. He wrote plainly, "A mother requests brief contact with her son, supervised and without publicity." He attached the social worker's assessment, the guardian's tentative consent, and his own note explaining why he believed the visit would do more to stabilize matters than any immediate punitive action. There was, too, the matter of how he presented himself. He could not afford to let his plea be dismissed as a sentimental stunt. He spoke to community advocates who knew the judge, found a retired clergy member willing to vouch for the woman's character, and sought out a liaison in the juvenile system who understood how to balance safety with family integrity. Each call was a risk. Each name added to a pile of associations that could be passed and presented as either concerted compassion or preferential treatment. As the days folded into one another, Daniel began sleeping less. He walked the city with a notebook that catalogued the voices he found persuasive and the facts that would make his appeal credible. At home, Rachel noticed the new ring beneath his eyes and asked softly whether he would walk away if it became a public fight. "I might have to," he answered, "or I might have to stand where I am and let them question why." In the center of the storm was the woman herself. In the quiet moments between interviews and filings, Daniel returned to the hospital room to check on her. She asked small things, whether he'd eaten, whether the weather was as cold as it felt, whether Noah was the kind of name that conjured a particular face. He brought her a notebook with a ribbon on the spine and told her to write whatever she wanted. She did. She wrote short sentences, things that felt like confessions without shame. "I miss his laugh. I remember the time he reached for the moon in a bathtub. Tell him I kept the sweater he wore the first winter." He read those lines in the privacy of his car, behind the wheel, the engine a low hum as the city moved around him. He thought of the cost of a single visit, of how a child's life could tumble into different hues with a held hand and a whispered reassurance. He thought of his own children's faces when they fell asleep by the glow of a lamp, and he understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity why he had said yes to trying. To him, the work was a matter of fidelity to the small, steady things that kept a city humane. The recognition of another person's grief, the refusal to let labels define possibility, the stubborn insistence that rules exist to serve people, not to hollow them out. Not every person in the precinct saw it that way. Someone leaked a rough sketch of the situation to a local columnist, a short, snide note about privilege and accountability, and the newsroom's curiosity flared. Daniel was careful in his public statements. No name-dropping, no dramatic invocations of mercy. He kept to factual filings and quietly pushed the paperwork forward. Yet as the story floated toward the public, it picked up edges that made his work harder. The billionaire's household naturally reacted to the news with a mixture of silence and lawyers. A spokesperson called the detention center only to be courteously deflected. The Guardian, previously calm, began to receive messages pressuring her to either allow or forbid the visit outright. It was in this compressed, frantic seam of time that Daniel arranged a meeting with a magistrate's clerk. The clerk was patient but clear-eyed. Compassionate visits were rare and required judicial oversight. Daniel asked for an expedited review on the basis of the child's best interests. The clerk listened, then said the slow, inevitable thing. The judge's calendar was full. Security checks took time. The consent forms had to be precise. At that moment, Daniel made a choice that would define his path. He could sit back and let the calendar rule the life in front of him, let the waiting system be the arbiter. Or he could pursue every reasonable avenue to shorten the wait, to make the legal path as straightforward as the law allowed. He chose the latter, but with his eyes open about what that choice might demand of him. He drafted an appeal, gathered signatures, coaxed a reluctant public defender into supporting the urgency, and assembled the maternal evidence that suggested the visit would be stabilizing, not sensational. There was a particular quiet meeting that crystallized the risk. Daniel was introduced to the judge's court aide in a narrow hallway lined with framed credentials. The aide, older, with an exacting stare, asked plainly why Daniel had invested himself so personally. "You could be in for criticism," she said. "You could be asked if you're allowing bias into your work." Daniel looked at the framed certificates and felt a pressure that was less about paper and more about how a single human decision could be read through a dozen skeptical lenses. He thought of the woman's thumb on the child's cheek in the photograph. He thought of the night's baby on the subway platform and the small promises that had lodged in his chest like coins in a fountain. "Because someone has to be the one who sees the person behind the file," he answered. "If not us, then who?" The aide did not smile. She did not need to. But she did, finally, take his request with a degree of professional curiosity that suggested a sliver of openness. She made the notation required, and Daniel left the courthouse with official stamps that meant something in the world of forms. At least for now, the machinery had recognized the human plea. A note on the timeline, the sequence of meetings, phone calls, and filings that follows, is compressed for clarity. Dramatic condensation. In truth, it unfolded across late nights, between school pickups and hospital shifts. In truth, it involved more emails than a single man should manage, and more silences than anyone could bear. But for the sake of this moment, what matters is the accumulation of small bureaucratic wins that formed the scaffolding for something larger. The press began to circle with a cautious curiosity that could be stoked into frenzy. Daniel felt the heat of it like a distant fire. Figures texting each other about the billionaire angle, an editor sketching a headline in a notebook. He fortified his confidentiality agreements and circled key players who would keep the moment private. The social worker, the guardian who had promised discretion, the juvenile services official who had reserved a quiet room for supervised visits. They agreed. No photos, no live streams, no intrusive presence. The child would be kept in a neutral space with a trained supervisor. The woman would be prepped for a brief encounter, aware of the rules, prepared to leave if Noah showed signs of distress. On the morning Daniel arrived at the detention center to finalize the paperwork, the air felt charged. He carried a folder with the signatures he had gathered and an updated note from the public defender that framed the visit as a therapeutic, short-term connection. In the waiting room, alongside the clipboards and the hum of fluorescent lights, he brushed shoulders with people who had no idea the fair grace they were about to enable. A janitor sweeping a hallway paused and looked up with the kind of curiosity that does not ask for explanation. A receptionist answered the phone with practiced cheer. Inside, the woman prepared herself in the way people prepare for a moment that can alter everything. She folded her hair neatly, smoothed the sweater that held Noah's smell, she had saved it, and closed her eyes for a small prayer she did not speak out loud. Daniel watched through the glass as she read the lines she had written the week before, whispering them to herself like a liturgy. "Noah, I will try to be brave." He could almost taste the edge of what would come next. The filing clerk called his name. The forms were stamped. The juvenile services supervisor made a last check. Then the assistant to the magistrate called to say the judge had agreed to a preliminary review. It was not an outright sweeping permission. It was, however, a crack in the institutional door big enough to let a human moment happen. And yet, Even as that word came, the world reminded Daniel that compassion could be an unstable currency. He found Marcus leaning against a wall near the clerk's desk, arms crossed, a newspaper in hand with a headline that hinted at scandal but provided no detail. Marcus offered a look that was part warning and part admiration. "You ready for the fallout?" he asked. Daniel imagined fallout like bricks falling from a scaffolding. He imagined phone calls from superiors, queries from public affairs, the thinly veiled outrage on comment threads. He imagined his family being pulled into comfortable discomfort. He imagined the judge asking him in open court why he had made this his cause. He imagined, too, that he would answer as simply as he had answered the aide in the hallway, because someone has to be the one who sees the person behind the file. As the preliminary review was scheduled, a final point of friction surfaced. The billionaire's household, long silent, provided a terse statement through counsel. The message was careful and dismissive. They would neither obstruct nor facilitate at that time. They claimed distance, an official separation between family and the city's processes. Daniel read the statement and felt, for the first time in the weeks of working the case, how the jagged edges of privilege could distance even love. The woman had been adopted into wealth that, at best, did not guarantee intimacy and, at worst, could impose an expectation of image that made coming forward a calculated risk. When Daniel told her about the judge's preliminary nod, she cried, not in shame, but in the particular unloading way of someone who had been carrying an unbearable weight. "That's all I wanted," she said, voice small. "I didn't want money or statements, or to be used as a headline. I wanted him to know I remembered his laugh." He sat with her then, for a long minute in the neutral air of a hospital holding room, while distant traffic provided a city-sized soundtrack. He thought about the work ahead, the hearing to convince a judge that a supervised visit was in the best interest of a child, the careful choreography required to keep a fragile moment safe, the emotional check he would have to conduct on himself when cameras might press in. He also thought about the man in the patrol car who had once held a sobbing mother on a subway platform, and the vow that had lodged in his heart to be someone who noticed. He thought of his own children and how he would want someone to fight on their behalf for the simplest kind of human decency. Outside the clinic, the day brightened into a thin, honest winter light. Daniel walked into the afternoon with the photograph still in his pocket, and with the knowledge that what he had been given was a chance, narrow and precarious, to make a different kind of report. The papers signed, the social worker's stamp, the guardian's nod. They were all small victories. He had not yet spoken to the magistrate in person, had not yet made the plea that would move the system from permission in principle to permission in practice. That moment waited in a courthouse hallway he had not yet crossed. He paused at the courthouse steps and felt the city's breath. He thought of the kind of hero the world expects and the kind of hero he was willing to be, ordinary, faltering, persistent. He had no illusions about how the story might end. There would be more forms and possibly more resistance. The trial of public opinion would not be kind. But there was also something luminous in front of him. A chance, perhaps, to make a child's memory less a rumor and more like a held thing. The magistrate's chamber door was cool under his hand when he reached it. Through the brass, he could hear the low murmur of someone reading a pile of papers. Daniel straightened the badge on his uniform, smoothed the folded photograph once more, and stepped inside to make a case for a single brief reconciliation. The magistrate's chamber smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. Sunlight slanted across a row of chairs and landed on a stack of files like a small, indifferent altar. Daniel set the photograph on the desk and, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself the awkward intimacy of looking at the child's face without the fear that the image might be misread. The magistrate, a woman with a steady voice and a habit of tapping a pen when she thought, looked at him in a way that made procedural logic feel both essential and provisional. "Officer Hayes," she said, not unkindly, You've brought a compassionate visit request forward with an urgency normally reserved for medical emergencies. Convince me this is in the child's interest." There were 1,000 ways to answer that sentence. Daniel could have recited policy, quoted statutes, or produced a list of precedents. Those were safe paths. He chose instead to do what he had done all along, to speak of the person beneath the paperwork. He told them about the photograph, how the child's hair had been ruffled as if by a father's careless hand, how the mother's thumb had traced a cheek in a way that suggested memory was a muscle she exercised daily. He spoke of the social worker's assessment, the guardian's reluctant but pragmatic consent, and the supervised setting juvenile services had offered. But he dwelt most on a small human point. Children do not understand adult reputations. They understand presence. "A child doesn't need explanations about headlines," he said, his voice calm but edged with a kind of insistence. "Noah needs, briefly, to see the person who says she loves him. He needs to register, in a way a court can't produce in a transcript, that someone kept him in mind. That matters for his development. It matters emotionally." The magistrate's pen hovered over a notepad. The courtroom aide beside her, the same woman from the hallway, observed him with an almost clinical curiosity. Outside, there were legal considerations no one in the chamber could ignore. The woman's custody status, the nature of the charges, privacy concerns, all of it mattered. Daniel did not downplay those facts. He made certain they were part of the record. He emphasized safety, supervision, and brevity. He framed the request as a narrow, careful exception, justified by therapeutic rationale rather than sentiment. When he finished, the magistrate asked to hear briefly from Juvenile Services and the guardian. The Juvenile Services supervisor described the prepared setting: a small, neutral room with soft chairs, a trained supervisor, a protocol for halting the visit at the first sign of distress, and a plan for post-visit debriefing for Noah. The guardian, voice steadier than Daniel expected, endorsed the plan without flourish. "He's my brother's son," she said. "He deserves that if it's safe. I'm not asking for anything more than what's best for him." The judge nodded. She had the wear of someone who had read grief into affidavit margins. "This will be strictly supervised," she said finally. "It will be brief. There will be no press, no recordings, and it will take place under Juvenile Services protocols. If anything suggests the child's welfare is at risk, the visit ends immediately." Daniel exhaled once, a long, small sound. The permission came with conditions, but permission it was, a narrow corridor, opening where none had been expected. The clerk stamped the order with a crisp, decisive thud, the kind of bureaucratic noise that can feel like a benediction in a house of rules. Dramatic condensation, weeks of scheduling and coordination, contracted into a handful of tense hours that followed the magistrate's order. In reality, there were more forms and more voices. But in that compact morning, the essential scaffolding for the meeting was put into place. The social worker confirmed the timing. The guardian agreed on a pickup location and a neutral route. Juvenile Services arranged the room and assigned a supervisor trained in family reunification. The public defender notified the woman of the decision and coached her on how the visit would proceed. Brief, supervised, without cameras, and with a staffer present to gently intervene at any sign of distress. Daniel spent the hours before the meeting performing a dozen small acts that felt less like heroism and more like the plumbing of mercy. He checked off forms, read protocols aloud to make sure he and everyone else shared the same vocabulary for safety, and ran through contingencies in his head. He made one last call to the guardian to confirm that Noah would be calm, and to reiterate the plan: a neutral room, an adult present, no surprises. The guardian's voice was practical. "He doesn't know much. He'll be fine," she said, but the fine came with the edge of someone bracing for heartbreak or relief. He sat in the waiting area as chairs scraped, and a clock kept time like a patient surgeon. The woman arrived, escorted by a small team. Daniel watched through the two-way glass as she took a breath and folded herself into the posture she had been practicing. Her hands smoothed the sweater she had saved, the one that carried faintly the smell of a small child's laundry. Her eyes met his through the glass and found him as if to borrow steadiness. There were no fanfares and no cameras, only the mute, intense focus of people who understood that even ordinary compassion can feel extremely loud when the public wants spectacle. When Noah came through the door, escorted by his aunt who held his hand with the casual firmness of someone who understood both playtime and protective time, he looked like any 5-year-old in weathered sneakers, slightly too curious about the world, slightly wary of strange rooms. He clung for a moment to his aunt's fingers, and then, at the sight of the woman, his face registered a small, complicated flash of recognition, as if a slice of memory had been handed to him like a familiar coin. The supervisor, a soft-voiced woman named Elise, with years of experience in child reunification, went quickly through the rules with both adults. "This is short," she said. "We watch. We intervene if needed. You may hold hands if it feels safe. If we see signs of distress, we'll stop. After 10 minutes, we'll step in and debrief." The woman's lip trembled in a way that minimized itself into something practical, a controlled tremor. Daniel watched, careful to remain a professional presence. He did not enter the room. He was an orchestrator at the margins, a safety net made of paperwork and presence. The moment remained between a mother and a child. They sat across from each other, and for a long breath nothing happened. Noah's eyes scanned the room, the way children check for toys or escape routes. Then he looked at the woman more closely. He had been 3 when some of these things had become fractured. His memory was a collage of smells and half-formed moments. He peered, then reached out as if to test the reality of what he saw. "Mom." His voice was a question and an experiment wrapped into a syllable. The woman leaned forward slowly, as if every movement might snap the fragile filament of recognition. "Noah," she said. "It's me. It's Mama." He blinked. There was something small and human in how he extended his hand, as if he were offering a trade for a toy. The woman took it with a tenderness that made the room's fluorescent light bend toward her. For a second, the script of social services and legalese seemed to fall away and leave only the simple, luminous fact of a child's fingers curled around an adult's palm. They talked in pieces, memories like puzzle fragments. She reminded him of the time he fell asleep on a pile of laundry and left a crayon behind. He announced he liked dinosaurs now. She smelled like day-old laundry and the hospital coffee they'd allowed her on the way to the meeting. Her sentences were brief and diligent. "I kept your sweater. I remember when you laughed at the bubbles. If you want, I can tell you about the ducks by the pond." Noah listened, the way children listen to stories that are starting to belong to them. He asked 1 or 2 halting questions, practical, precise things that show a child's mind at work. "Where do you sleep? Why did you go away?" And the woman answered with the minimal honesty adults give when they know truth must be folded into age. At one point, Noah tilted his head and reached for her face the way a child reaches for a balloon, out of curiosity more than intent. The supervisor watched them like a guardian star, ready to step in, but did not. The touch was neither dramatic nor cinematic. It was a small, ordinary connection. The woman's breath hitched, and she let out a little laugh that sounded like relief coated in salt. Daniel, watching from the other side of the glass, felt the tenderness like a physical warmth. Time, as it always does in such rooms, rushed. Elise kept one eye on a small wall clock, and at 9 minutes and a few seconds suggested gently, "We'll wrap up in a minute." The woman nodded, and the end of the visit became a presence in the room, like an approaching weather front, visible, inevitable. They said things that a court cannot demand and a law cannot keep. "I love you," the woman whispered, an economy of words heavy as some fulsome confession. Noah's answer was simple: "I know," spoken with the steadiness of a child who has learned survival's vocabulary. They hugged briefly, supervised and soft, and it was not a narrative crescendo so much as a seal on a small human truth. Here was recognition. Here was a remembrance. Here was a moment of dignity. When the 10 minutes ended, Elijah, Noah's aunt, took his hand and eased him out, giving the woman a final protective look. The supervisor led a small debrief, noting things for a report on the child's reaction, the mother's composure, and recommendations for follow-up support. The woman's eyes, when they met Daniel's across the room, shone with a complex gratitude. She did not speak his name. She needed no name. Her thanks was in a look that acknowledged his role without collapsing him into a savior. Outside the room, the city felt unchanged. Cars still climbed over one another like a reluctant chorus. Vendors still called out over the rhythm of their day. But inside, a narrow, fenced-off human need had been honored. It was small and huge at once. A child's right to know, a mother's right to be seen, a system's capacity, however measured, to bend toward mercy. The aftermath was not cinematic. There was no swell of a triumphant soundtrack. There was a stack of reports to file, a juvenile services recommendation to note, and a social worker's plan to connect the family with counseling services. The child's guardian and the social worker agreed on a follow-up plan that would include supervised calls and a possible future, longer contact plan if Noah's therapist recommended it. The woman returned to custody with a lighter step than she had arrived with. Daniel filed an incident report that was concise and careful, describing only what had occurred and the safety protocols observed. News outlets inevitably sought details. Some respected the privacy the Juvenile Services Agreement had created. Others tried to pass the event for sensation. A local blog ran a piece about a curious visit and left out the child's name, noting only that contacts were made, which the precinct's public affairs office handled calmly with a reminder of policy. Questions were asked in sticky little memos about optics. Daniel answered them with the same tone he had used in the magistrate's chamber: professional, factual, unornamented. There were, of course, costs. An internal affairs clerk filed the routine inquiry into the decision-making process, not as an accusation but as a check on how discretion had been used. Daniel cooperated fully, providing timelines, signed forms, and the list of professionals who had approved the visit. He knew such oversight was not a punishment, but a necessary balance, an institution ensuring that no good deed was a cover for favoritism. At home that night, the house felt quieter, as if gratitude had settled into the furniture. Rachel greeted him with the practiced warmth of someone who had lived with a man who took his work home in the shape of small silences. She had been informed in the simplest terms, permission granted, visit occurred, and had sat with their children, explaining in language gentle and true that sometimes adults had to help other families in small ways. When Daniel entered the kitchen, the kids were already at the table drawing. The younger boy showed him a half-colored dinosaur with a solemn pride. Rachel poured him a cup of tea without asking questions about consequences. She had watched him carry the weight of his choice and had seen the way it had changed him. The shape of his change was not dramatic. His movements were slightly slower, as if he measured kindness with a new care. Word traveled through the department in the manner such stories always do, muted admiration, threaded with the occasional snide worry. Marcus stopped by his desk and handed him a thermos with a half-grin. "You did all right," he said, an admission that had the softness of respect. "Expect some calls, expect questions, but you did all right." The internal review concluded predictably with a note that diligence had been observed, and that the visit fell within the acceptable bounds of compassionate procedure. The final memo contained phrases like "best interest of the child" and "appropriately supervised." It also included a quiet commendation from juvenile services for what their supervisor called a careful, child-centered approach. Udi, the department's leadership, who had been wary in the early days, issued a terse statement recognizing that officers sometimes must exercise discretion in the interests of human welfare. The statement was careful, as statements of institutions often are, but it did not humiliate. There was no disciplinary hearing, there was no retraction. There was, instead, a minor reshaping of how discretion and duty could coexist. For the woman, the visit did not erase what had led her into custody. It did something narrower, but no less important. It placed a moment of recognition between her and a child who might otherwise grow up without the memory of that touch. She wrote a short note to Daniel later, passed through counsel, thanking him for seeing her as a person and for handling the visit with quiet resolve. She asked only that her child be protected from the press and kept warm during the cold nights. Daniel forwarded the note to juvenile services, who placed it in the child's case file as a small trace of history. The city, as always, continued to be a place of paradoxes. Wealth that could shield, neighbors who could act as anchors, systems that both failed and corrected. The billionaire's household remained off-stage, issuing no comment beyond a lawyerly insistence that family matters were private. In the weeks that followed, a few cautious columns praised the human element of the visit, while reminding readers that no one should be above the law. Online threads split predictably. Some lauded the moral courage of an officer who wielded his discretion for compassion, while others argued that privilege could make mercy a spectacle. The fractured chorus of public opinion had the odd effect of making the small human moment feel both larger and more fragile. Daniel found in the months after the visit that his work took on a new cadence. He continued to file reports, to take calls, to sit with people whose struggles were ordinary and urgent. But he also found his attention attuned to little mercies. He brought an extra sandwich to a teenage girl living in a shelter. He sat with an elderly man who needed help filling out a form. These were gestures the world often considers small, yet they clustered together around his days like a network of tiny beacons. In a community meeting months later, a social worker stood to speak about the case, anonymized of course, and about the way small, well-managed acts of compassion could stabilize a child's life. The woman herself did not attend public panels. She needed privacy more than platform. But juvenile services reported positive, if cautious, progress in Noah's sense of security. The follow-up counseling helped him make sense of the visit and integrate it into his life story as a gentle chapter rather than an unresolved mystery. The professional consequences Daniel feared never arrived in the dramatic way he had imagined. He was not promoted that year, though promotions in police departments often depend on an array of factors that are more administrative than moral. There were opportunities he might have pursued and whispers he might have ignored. But Rachel stayed by his side through the longer nights of paperwork and the quiet shifts of public attention. Their children continued to believe their father was a man who did the right thing, even when that thing complicated life. There were, inevitably, personal lessons that clung to him. He learned in a deeper register about the particular humility required to be an authority figure who also kept his heart open. He learned that advocacy does not guarantee perfection, only that one must be willing to risk the bureaucratic discomfort that comes with humanizing a file. He accepted the idea that a career in service means sometimes walking into small hazards, not because they are glorious, but because they are necessary. Months later, on a mild spring evening, he bumped into the social worker Carla at a community outreach event. They stood on the sidewalk, breathing the warm air, and talked about the case not as a singular triumph, but as an example of many small institutional gears working the way they were meant to when people kept the child's interests central. "You did what you believed was right," she said simply. "That's all any of us can do." He thought about the woman and about Noah, about a hug that lasted 9 minutes and some seconds, and about how that length of time had felt infinite in its tenderness. There were no cinematic reunions in the months that followed, no erasures, only the long, ongoing work of therapy, of supervised calls, of slow rebuilding. That rebuilding was not a tidy arc. It was an accumulation of small moments that made the child's world steadier. In the quiet of their kitchen, months after the event had faded from headlines, Daniel and Rachel sat with the soft sigh of ordinary night sounds. Their younger boy had fallen asleep with a half-drawn picture of a dinosaur tucked beside him, and their older daughter had curled up with a book. He told Rachel, without grand gestures, that he had felt something change in his understanding of service, that seeing a human need and having the authority to meet it, carefully and lawfully, had altered something in the way he approached his work. "You didn't make headlines," Rachel said, smiling. "You made a life a little kinder." He laughed, a small sound, and felt not the rush of vindication, but the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing when doing right meant complexity. He would not claim that his action had transformed the system. It had not. It had, however, reminded him, and perhaps others, that systems exist to be used for human ends. That was, he thought, a kind of victory. In the weeks and months that followed, he sometimes wondered about how the story might change in the telling. Would people remember the supervised protocol, the juvenile services debrief, the guardian's calm assent, or would they only remember a short headline about a billionaire's adopted daughter and an officer who granted a last wish? The truth, as he had come to know it, lived in the small, private facts: a child's tentative reach, a mother's careful steadiness, a supervisor trained to notice the first sign of distress. The rest belonged to the public appetite for narrative, which often wants things to be simpler than they are. There were moments of quiet reward: a letter from a community advocate praising the humane option, a short note from a colleague acknowledging that risking caution sometimes redeems a case file. And then, in the ordinary rhythm of things, there were also moments when the system reminded him of its limits, cases where privacy couldn't be maintained, where custody battles extended beyond the reach of a single visit, where resources for long-term reunification were inadequate. Daniel accepted those realities without cynicism, choosing instead to let the small victory of one supervised visit stand as a model for what could be done when people prioritized human dignity. He kept the photograph of Noah in a sealed case in his locker for a time, less as a trophy than as a tether to a simple fact that sometimes seeing is what someone needs most. Months later, the woman wrote through counsel to juvenile services asking for continued supervised contact. It was not a sweeping revival of family life. It was a careful, patient request that recognized limits and worked within them. The guardianship arrangement remained, a protective structure for Noah, and the supervised visits became part of a longer plan that included therapy and stable routines. It was not a neat narrative, but it was progress. As spring moved into summer, Daniel found himself back at his runs through the park, watching the city wake and thinking about how small acts ripple. He had, in the end, not become a figure of public fame. He had not been granted a medal or a promotion line written by his name. He was instead an officer who had used the authority given to him to provide a brief, necessary human connection. That, he thought, was enough. The title that had once seemed like a headline, revealed, "An officer grants the last wish of the billionaire's adopted daughter," was more complicated in reality than any single sentence could hold. The billionaire remained a shadow, a backdrop that made the human moment feel oddly public, but it was not the engine of the story. The engine was a child's need and a mother's attempt to be remembered in a way that mattered. On a dark evening when the city hummed with distant traffic and the kids were asleep, Daniel stood at his kitchen window and watched a neighbor walk a dog under the lamplight. He turned and found Rachel at the sink, drying a plate, and felt the steady, domestic rhythm that anchors most lives. He did not think of himself as a rescuer or as a lawyer of mercy. He thought of himself as someone who had been given a responsibility and had chosen carefully to exercise it for a human end. "If this story teaches anything," he told Rachel quietly, "it's that small, steady acts matter, not because they make headlines, but because they put a hand back in someone's life." Rachel smiled without looking up from her plate. "We do what we can," she said, "and sometimes that's enough." Years from then, when Noah would be older and his memory of the day a patchwork of feelings, the supervised visit would exist as a seam in his life story. A seam that, while not erasing the rest of his challenges, would hold a place of warmth he could return to. The woman's later steps would be the work of therapy, of accountability, and of slow re-engagement with a child who would define their relationship on his terms. Daniel would carry the memory of the photograph and the 10-minute room as a quiet compass in his work. In the end, the revelation that had once threatened to be a spectacle became something quieter, an example of what can happen when institutional actors choose to see the person behind the file. There is no single moral in a long life, but if one were to be drawn from this narrow story, it might be that mercy, when exercised within the guardrails of responsibility, can hold a child and a mother together across the brittle edges of public opinion. Revealed, perhaps, is the idea that policy and compassion can coexist, not because rules bend at will, but because people choose, within those rules, to act with both care and courage. Daniel returned to his rounds, to his family, to the small rituals that kept a home steady. He continued to file reports and to take calls. He continued quietly to be an ordinary man willing to do the necessary, sometimes unpopular work of seeing another human being. If this story reached you and moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that small acts of empathy often matter more than grand declarations. Leave a comment. What would you do if you were faced with the same choice?